Good morning, everyone. I am Gail Owings, the Director of the Stories of the Chesapeake Heritage Area, and I'm really happy that you have joined us today for the second part of our workshop series, Make That Project Happen. The first part is recorded, and we sent you a link about that recording, and that addresses tips on grant writing and managing grants. And I am happy today to say we're going to be talking about storytelling and finding that all-important match. Robert Ferloni, who is the president of the Stories of the Chesapeake Heritage Area and Eastern Shore Heritage Inc., and also a cultural resources consultant, will be starting us off with a presentation on tips on how to tell your story. And as we all know, in grant writing, it's so important to tell a compelling story. But once you get that story set and those key messages, you can use them for fundraising and presentations. So getting those tips and storytelling right is also important. Katie Parks of Preservation Maryland will join us to talk about grants available from Preservation Maryland. And then I'll close up with just a discussion on the different types of grants and what matches what, and how to document some of your grant matches, including your volunteer match. So we're going to go, I'll turn it over to Robert. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Gail. I greatly appreciate it. As Gail said, I'm the president of the Chesapeake Heritage Area, Stories of the Chesapeake. And the idea with the work that we're doing is trying to promote a variety of different types of capacity workshops. So we're happy that you're here and able to participate with us today. In addition to that, though, I have been in your shoes and have been in both worlds, essentially as a grant writer myself, working for nonprofits and cultural institutions, crafting grants, and then also serving on grant review panels for MHAA, the Maryland State Arts Council, state and federal agencies as well. So I know both how to craft the grant and also what grant review panelists are looking for. In addition to that, I teach a grant writing course at the University of Delaware in their museum studies programs for graduate students and PhD students. So this is something that I'm involved in many, many different ways, wearing a variety of different hats. What I'm going to do is share my screen, and we'll start off talking a little bit about some of the general basics, but framed from storytelling perspectives. Now, the idea behind this is we've had a series of different workshops, and there's a recording on our website that goes over some of the general information in specifics to the MHAA grants, both the capital grants as well as the non-capital grants. What we're going to talk about today is how we can assist you specifically by crafting a grant that's compelling, utilizing storytelling frameworks, and also talking about making a match. So Stories of the Chesapeake is here really to support your work. As I mentioned, we have another grant workshop that's more basic, and I highly recommend that you participate and look at the material in that recording. I'll cover some of the basics here, but really focusing on storytelling. One of the things to really keep in mind is that there's many different benefits to grants and also significant problems as well. And you want to make sure that the project that you're putting together aligns with the mission of your organization, the objectives and goals of the granting institution, and also think specifically about the benefits to the community. More and more philanthropy is really looking at direct impact on lives. And one of the things that we want to emphasize in a lot of these grant proposals is what the work that you're doing is going to do to really benefit your stakeholders. And there's a variety of different ways of thinking about how grants are helpful in terms of investing locally, supporting community, empowering people, nurturing innovation. There's lots of different ways of really framing this, but you want to be sure as you start thinking about your project, how you want to frame the conversation. What is the story that you're trying to tell with regards to this grant? Why is it important and meaningful? And why should the granting organization select you for the funds that it's acting as the steward of? So everything should really come back to that sense of how is this going to be beneficial to the community and also to the organization that's giving the funds, not necessarily just your institution, museum, or historic site. And as I said, there's lots of benefits to grants, but there's also significant problems as well. So one of the things that you want to take into consideration are some of the issues that are more problematic. These are the things that we've covered in some of our other grant workshops. But There's issues with a long process. Not many grants are necessarily funded each year. They're not renewable. Often you're able to get funds for creating the project, but not necessarily for long-term sustainability. Power dynamics of how things are being issued and controlled and passed out. Often this idea of the tail wagging the dog, that cultural institutions write grants specifically to try to get funding rather than having a project in mind and then finding the grant funding that aligns with that. And also the opportunity costs. It takes a tremendous amount of time, not just to write the grant, but to manage, administer, and report. So you want to keep in mind all of these things when you are putting together your project and make sure that the story that you're trying to tell aligns with the cost benefits. So for today, we're going to be focusing on the beginning of the grant lifecycle, generating your idea, finding funding, and developing your proposal. But again, as I said, you want to keep in mind that it's not just about the proposal. You should have a very clear vision and be creative about how you're going to put forth your story, but make sure that the work that you're doing is going to be effective in the long term and that you're going to have the capacity to see it through to fruition. And this should be built into the story that you tell. So when you're creating your grant proposal, there's a variety of different types of segments within it itself, but you want to make sure that you're touching upon these different things. So you can tell your story from start to finish, explain and show that you understand the overall process, the objectives and the goals of the project, but also that you're going to be able to successfully see it through fruition and be a good steward for the agency's funds. So all of these different things could be touched upon when you're telling your story. It's not necessarily just the focal point of trying to get that funding. And I think too many grant writers only think about writing the proposal, getting the grant, and not about all the other steps and part of the grant lifecycle after the fact. And if you make a clear and succinct case for the work that initial keys to a strong proposal, and preparation is a key part of this. One of the issues I often see with individuals is the fact that they're not prepared when they're putting their work together. So you want to make sure that you familiarize yourself with resource materials. Most funders are very good about posting information and objectives and goals and how they're going to judge based on criteria the work of the different proposals that are coming in. So take your time, spend a good amount of time going through these different resource materials, and then it'll help you better frame your proposal and understand how to craft your story to match the objectives and goals of the organization. Know your program officer. Your program officer, like Gail Owings, our executive director, is there to assist you rather than having grant proposals come in that don't really hit the mark. And they can explain to you exactly what's eligible, what's not. I'm not saying, but unfortunately, I can't tell you the number of projects that we see that come in that don't align. The narrative might be wonderful, but it's not backed up by the budget or the timeline. There might be people to do so in the narrative, but you need to think about each and every segment across the grant proposal itself. All of these things should be working to support the larger proposal, but you have opportunities to create stories within those other pieces. So for example, talking about the scope of work, talking about collaborations or partners, explaining how this might fit into the heritage, should be able to demonstrate capacity. And again, these last two things consist consistency, demonstrating capacity should be tied to the dedicated that the system actually needs, and that you're able to integrate that into the story itself. So it have to be quantitative. I think often we focus too much on numbers, but you want to focus more on qualitative information and thinking about how you're more engaging in terms of what the grant review panel is going to look at, rather than just having a long list of numbers, CVs, or resumes. And again, the idea behind this is really focusing on something that's inspirational. You want to be creative. You want your story to inspire people. And through these ideas and collaboration, you're going to be able to be much more successful in terms of securing your grant funding. So some other keys to a strong proposal I think about are having innovative, engaging projects. And often when we're doing our work, we end up having a situation where we're thinking more so about general operations or the restrictions and limitations. The projects that tend to come to the top are the ones that are most innovative and interesting and influential, the ones that are going to have the biggest impact. So when you're creating your project, you want to make sure that you're emphasizing the things that make this unique or different, that position you well to do this type of work. And really, again, it shows how this is something that's going to be beneficial to the community. As I said, you want to show that you can demonstrate capacity and expertise. And this can be done either with people that you have on staff or outside consultants, volunteers, contractors that you might be working on. So this, again, doesn't have to be just a long laundry list of people per se, but you want to integrate that into the storytelling process itself. So you could explain how you're bringing in a particular individual, what their expertise and professional experience is, and how they're going to bring this really phenomenal set of skills to the project itself, using text and narrative prose rather than just focusing on the more specific types of technical aspects when you're uploading CVs into the grant portal. It should be tied to the mission of the organization. Again, too often we see organizations that have this sense of the tail to wagging the dog, where they're creating a project because they're able to write a grant and secure funding for a project. But it should be the other way around. What I often advocate for with institutions is coming up with a long list of projects that they would like to do, to really focus on strategic planning, have an interpretive plan of what they are hoping to do successfully, how they're going to create an engaging visitor experience, and then have this list that they can go to and go out and look for the funding from there rather than the other way around. So the hope is that you have a strategic vision for what your organization is going to do, and then you can align resources accordingly. But the focus really needs to be something that's tied to the mission of the organization. You also want to be tied to the grant objectives. There's situations where I've seen different organizations that I've partnered or worked with who for some reason think that if they can just make a strong enough case in their grant proposal, they'll be able to get the organization to fund their project, even though they may not fund public health or environmental education or focus on collections management. You need to make sure whatever your project is really focuses on the objectives of that particular granting organization. And you want to emphasize those elements when you're telling your story. Go through, as I said, those resources that they post online, all of the materials that they have on their websites, so you can highlight and identify exactly what their goals are, the different types of projects that they've successfully funded in the past, what they're saying about their overall objectives of their organization is, and then you can emphasize that in your story, hitting key points and reinforcing those ideas as you go through. You want to have a clear layout and have this cross-check. As I said, your story needs to be consistent. Sometimes we've gotten grants in where people had a very strong, compelling, and interesting narrative, but the pieces were missing in the other segments of the grant proposal. I can't advocate enough that you make sure that your scope of work, your timeline, your budget, your resources, everything aligns across the board. And as I said, again, using those segments as individual short stories to help support the larger story of your proposal as a whole. So really see those as opportunities, but make sure that they're consistent and they're telling the same story. There's been situations where the pieces of grant proposals coming in were really interesting and engaging, but they didn't align and they didn't make sense as a whole. And as a grant reviewer, it's really problematic when we see someone make a wonderful case for a project, but the budget doesn't align with what they're trying to actually do, or the timeline doesn't make sense with what they're trying to do. So make sure that you're cross-checking everything in alignment. Also being realistic about delegating responsibilities. Understand what you're going to be able to do and then work collaboratively with other partners. Think about your in-kind match with volunteers. Think about what you can actually do with partners to help you be successful. As I said, more and more philanthropic organizations, state and federal grants are looking for the community impact. So working in partnership and collaboration with others is going to give you a much better chance of getting that grant funded. So essentially, the narrative or the project description is the summary, the piece where you can really make the story most. You want to have an overall summary of the project that is clear, succinct, and understandable to the panelists. So you want your project description and narrative to have most of the information about your story, but as I said, you'll have it sprinkled out in other places as well. But the summary is your chance to really make your case for why your project's important and make a creative and compelling story. You should discuss specific outcomes and objectives. And again, the idea behind this isn't necessarily to have a bullet point of all the different things that you're hoping to achieve, but integrate that into a story in a meaningful way. Talk about how the project, if funded, is going to really change what people are doing, how your organization is going to be revitalized, how it's going to benefit the community as a whole, the way that it's going to increase the number of visits of public school children, or how you're going to be able to use virtual online platforms to bring in new audiences or serve populations that might not be able to come to your site. Really think about how you could use those objectives and outcomes in the story itself. Hard numbers are often helpful, but again, sometimes I find that grants tend to focus too much on the quantitative. And if you have just a lot of data and facts, it's much more abstract than something that's inspirational or aspirational. Grant review panelists are looking for that qualitative information, and using the hard numbers is helpful to show that you know your visitors, you know your audience, you understand what the impact is going to be on that exhibit or program, but it really shouldn't be the first and foremost piece that you're utilizing when you're trying to convince people to fund you. A key part also is discussing sustainability. This is one of the problems I think that a lot of organizations deal with when they're dealing with grants, is they're able to get the seed money to create a program. They're able to put together a project and get it up and running, but they're not able to sustain it once it becomes part of their general operations day to day. Those general operating services are very difficult, and you want to be able to incorporate how you're going to be sustainable in the long term and build that into your story. As I said, this goes into that whole life cycle of the grant, and hopefully that you're not doing this just specifically to get the funding, but you have a plan in place to make sure that the project that it's going to be funded is going to be meaningful and an influential part of the work that the cultural institution, museum, or historic site is doing going forward. So build that into your story. You want to make the case for why you should be funded, but you should also make for the case for how you're going to be able to ensure that it's going to be seen through fruition and be successful for years to come. It's helpful to be succinct, clear, and specific as well. You don't want to be overly verbose. You don't want to have a lot of vernacular or jargon necessarily. You want it to be clear for the grant review panelists to look at what you have. You have to remember that often they're looking at dozens of these different grants. And that's part of the thing to think about with regards to telling the story as well, is if you just have a lot of data and facts and dry information, it's hard for a grant review panelist to really connect to your project. By framing it as an inspirational and compelling narrative, you are going to have a much better chance of doing so. But you need to be succinct, clear, and specific, because with the vast majority of grant review portals, you have a limited number of words that you can use for this. What I often do when I'm telling my story is just start off by writing, taking a Word document and writing my ideas down, and then going in and plugging those sections into the different segments of the grant procedure or protocol that they have adopted. So you can cut and paste and move things around. And really, in many ways, it's like when you're creating the plot, the narrative, the characters, you're able to adjust things accordingly to try to tell the entire story. So knowing that you might not be able to fit everything in the narrative, for example, you can find other places where you can still fit in that information later on. So it's almost like a puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle, where you're moving pieces from place to place. As I said, you don't want to embellish or exaggerate. I think often there's a problem where people want to show that they're going to have a more significant impact that they are going to, that they're going to have tens of thousands of people coming to their festival, or their exhibit is going to be reached out by the entire mid-Atlantic seaboard. Really be specific about what your expectations are, because the grant review panelists are going to be, I think, much more open to understanding that people are realistic in their expectations, and that those people who tend to exaggerate or overly embellish what the impact of the project is going to be are being unrealistic, or in some cases dishonest in terms of how they're framing their story. And essentially, this is something that's becoming more and more important too, is how your project will be evaluated. And this is where things get difficult, because it's easy to quantify things by counting the number of people who came into a gallery, talking about the number of school visits or children who were approached. But in terms of impact and thinking about the overall benefit to the community, those qualitative pieces are a little bit more difficult to combat. So you want to think about how you're going to measure success. What are your benchmarks, and how are you going to evaluate if the project you're putting together actually was meaningful and did what it was supposed to do? And if you have the space to do so, I highly recommend including an evaluation piece into your story as well. Again, sometimes this is limited in terms of the number of space that you have, but this is something that more and more grant review panelists are looking for, is how you're going to assess your success and what you've done. So in terms of objectives and outcomes, this is really the key as well. You want to make sure that you clearly understand what you're doing is accomplishable, that you're realistic and you're going to be able to do this. You want to be innovative, as I said, and ambitious. It's helpful for people to take a chance to be strong, to actually have the leadership to do something that's different. And those are the types of projects that really stand out. If every organization continually has a static exhibition, or the same type of audio guide, or a lesson plan, it's a thing that we see year and year after each other. And we want to try to find things that's going to be different and make you distinct and stand out from the crowd. So at the state level, if the MHA grant review panels are looking at 142 different projects, you want to try to find a way of making your project stand out. Explain why the project is necessary. This is an important thing too, and I would highly recommend integrating this into the narrative and having it at the beginning of your story, making the case for why this project is needed. Often organizations leave this out and they don't explain why this particular project that they're putting together, whether it's restoring a particular building or creating a particular type of special event, why this is needed by the community, how it's going to be meaningful and beneficial to the group, or how the organization is going to benefit from it as well. So really explaining how the project is necessary is something you want to focus on, and have it early on as part of your story, so you can make the case for why it's needed, and then you explain how you're going to achieve the project through the grant. Quantify the goals to show impact. Again, it's not bad to have the numbers necessary. You want to have numbers and really talk about the goals, but you also want to have the qualitative aspect of the impact. And then show that the project is a priority. Specifically with the MHAA grants, one of the things that we're looking at is urgency as one of the criteria in our rubric when we're looking at the panels, grant review panels going over all of the projects itself. So if there's only a certain number of projects we can fund each year, the ones that have to happen, where there's a sense of urgency or need, if it's tied to a commemoration, if a building is in jeopardy or danger, if it's tied to an overall effort of a network of partners that is underway, really emphasizing why this project has to happen now is going to be important. And putting that in your story, explaining why your project has to happen in this grant cycle is really going to be beneficial to you, because if there are other projects that need to happen right away, even though you have a strong proposal and it's a solid project, it might not happen even though the grant panel would like to fund it, just because it doesn't have that sense of urgency. So I think I'm going to take a break and ask if anyone has any questions at this point before I go on to some more storytelling techniques and aspects. Are there any questions?
I don't see anything in the chat. I do have a comment or a question.
Okay.
Do you find adding pictures to be helpful?
I do. So personally, I have a background in education, and I do a lot of work with teaching. Obviously, I was a public school teacher, middle school and high school teacher in New York City, a museum educator. I'm now a college professor. And what I often try to do whenever I'm teaching in any capacity is have information in different ways, because we have different learners with many different styles. And there's some people who are going to focus on the plot, the story, the text. There's others who are going to be compelled by visual images. There's other people who really look at the budget and the particular numbers. So when you're creating your grant proposal, when you're crafting your story, you want to integrate all of those pieces, knowing that the grant review panel who's looking at this has a variety of different preferences and biases based on how they internalize information. So if you could incorporate pictures showing, for example, students in your site doing this type of work, or examples of interpretive panels that you have in mind at other sites that are successful, or augmented reality, virtual reality projects, whatever it might be, really incorporating those pieces, I think, are going to be beneficial, because it's a way of telling your story in different ways. You can tell your stories with text, but you can also tell your story with the visual images or with the numbers themselves as well. And this is often helpful with regards to the urgency, particularly if you're working on something that has to happen because there's a project that's in danger or it's an ongoing partnership. Using the images is a way to help reinforce your story and create that narrative. So I highly recommend it. And most organizations now who are accepting information through virtual platforms allow you to upload PDFs of images, or in some cases, even like short MOVs of video clips and things like that, depending on what the work is. So particularly when you have a project that you're trying to put together and you're talking about the need for restoration or preservation of a building, showing the existing conditions and how things are really deteriorated, what needs to be done in terms of mitigating damage, pictures are worth 1,000 words, because you could explain what's happening, but people see a picture of a roof caving in or masonry that's starting to fall apart. That makes a tremendous amount of difference. And like I said, if you have in mind an interactive project with kids, seeing a picture of those children doing something experiential and interactive in a site is going to mean a lot more than having a paragraph explaining why getting kids out in nature is important as well. So I highly recommend using as many different types of ways of telling your story as possible.
We have a question in the chat. It says, what is your advice on how to show capacity for new capital projects that are not part of a formal organization? And I actually know which project this is.
That's not part of a formal organization?
Yes, and I would just add that this particular project is on the Chesapeake Country All-American Road. And I think that addressing that and that the new tourism that's being generated through that effort is going to make a difference. But Robert, you can go ahead and.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think capacity can be shown in many different ways. And if you don't have the internal capacity, showing that you have partnerships with other organizations or collaborators, or you've identified consultants that you would bring on and you have support letters, things like that is going to be greatly helpful. Because many of the organizations, especially small history museums in this country, are run by volunteers who don't have significant staffs or a lot of capacity. So as grant review panelists, we're often looking at like how this money that we're going to be giving out is going to be leveraged. And those partnerships, those support structures, the networking is really crucial. And by using that proposal to show that you've already identified these partners and collaborators, you can really reinforce the story that you're trying to tell. So again, you might not have the people on staff, but you could have a support letter from a consultant saying how they're going to help on an interpretive planning project. Or you could get estimates from a contractor with information and the contractor showing, explaining like what they're going to do and how they see this as a very important project to be undertaken by the community. So I'm often involved with writing NEA or NEH grants, and that's something that we look at from the perspective of incorporating scholars who are going to be brought in. I highly recommend trying to utilize those things. And again, thinking about those as ways of having short stories to tell your larger story. That's just a piece of your proposal. Okay, so we'll move on with regards to storytelling and framing. So we talked a little bit about this, but you want to make your story stand out. What is different or unique about your story? How is your story very meaningful, and what is it going to do with regards to helping your institution move forward? Again, when we're looking at this as grant review panelists, we often have dozens of grants that we're looking at, and we're sitting down usually at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day, whatever it might be, with a dedicated amount of time to look at all of these grant proposals. So you want to identify ways of making your grant proposal stand out. And it could be through the project itself. It could be through the partnerships. It could be through the innovation. It could be the way that you tell the story and how it's framed. All of those things are going to make your grant stand out. You want to think about what you can do to make yourself really distinctive. The best way to do this is making it inspirational. You want to make people who are reading this enthusiastic and passionate about your project. You want them to understand why this is really beneficial and how it's important and meaningful for this project to take place. So when you're writing your grant, you should think about how you could inspire the people to get behind your project itself. It shouldn't just be straightforward data and information where they're looking at a laundry list or a menu of the different types of things and making sure that it seems reasonable in terms of what's going to cost. You want people to look at that proposal and really become enthusiastic about what it could do to change and be transformational. Again, as I said, it should be cohesive. Throughout the entire grant proposal, you want to think of this as one structure, not separate, distinct pieces that you're trying to make your case, but think about how you can make it flow from one piece to the other. As I said, when I'm often writing my grants, I work on writing the grant holistically over a period of time and then use the different pieces to talk about making a particular point. But it all comes back to that larger story. So I just see those different segments as opportunities for telling different parts of the overall story. You want to emphasize the community impact. More and more grants are incorporating this. I know when I was reviewing grants for the Maryland State Arts Council, and when we're reviewing grants at MHAA, we're specifically looking for how the project is going to meet the impact of the community. Cultural institutions have a social responsibility to the sites and communities where they're situated. And the idea behind this is they should be thinking about what they can do to make a real change and impact on people's day-to-day lives, by the fact that those sources of funding could be used for other things like hospitals or public education, public health. So we really need to make the case for how the work that we're doing is essentially making the community a better and safer and healthier place. You also want to sell that vision. Focus on how the overall vision of the project is going to be crucial and keep re-emphasizing that. So you want to lay that out in the narrative, but come back to it time and time again so they understand the vision, overall vision of your project as a whole. So there's different ways of doing this. As I said, the vision is key, and your vision for this project should fit in succinctly and tightly with the mission of your organization, as well as the overall goals of the funder as well. So you want to make sure that you're consistently and constantly going back and forth and emphasizing how all of these different pieces align to the work that you're currently doing, the work that you're hoping to develop in the future, and the objectives and goals of the funder itself. You want a very persuasive summary. So the idea behind this is, I'm sure when people start writing grants, they don't think about it as a persuasive type of situation. They don't think about the voice that they can use or how they're going to craft their story to really make it meaningful. But it's your job in many ways to sell the project to the grant review panel and to the funding agency. So you want to create a situation where you're framing your story in a way that's going to really inspire people, as I said, but make them buy into the project themselves. Make them see why out of all the different projects they have in front of them on the table, your project is one that should be ranked highly. And the persuasive aspects of that is really crucial, explaining how it's really important. And this idea of a voice is important as well. There's some people who feel that they are better with more straightforward informational writing. There's some people who like to incorporate humor. There's some other people who think about this idea of focusing on empathy or compassion. Really think about the voice of the proposal and try to have that be consistent throughout the proposal as well, because sometimes we've seen where there's a kind of disconnect where different individuals are working on the grant proposal. Each one of them might be delegated a different part, and then they don't really align very smoothly. So you want an overall consistent voice that is inspirational and compelling throughout the entire piece. And then in addition to that, you want to think about the vocabulary and terms that you're using. So this could be beneficial or this could be really problematic. You don't want to use terms that are too insider, vernacular, and jargon that might be tied to the field. Often grant review panelists are coming from a wide variety of different backgrounds. They might not know about some of the technical terms or a variety of different types of things that you're using. So sometimes it's helpful to have an outsider read your grant and just go over it and see if it makes sense to them. So you want to be careful to avoid using specific terms that are going to be problematic, confusing, or might seem ambiguous. And at the same time, go back to that early chart that I showed you of how grants can be beneficial. And you might want to plug in some of the information terms that people are looking for with regards to the type of work that's taking place today, because people are going to understand how this fits into the community or the region where you are. So essentially, the key part of it really is thinking about all the various segments as parts of the larger story. The summary, the narrative, that's the lion's share of where you're going to tell your story. But you can use other pieces like the budget to help emphasize pieces of the story. You can have information in the scope of work or in the area where you're talking about urgency or how this aligns with heritage area objectives and goals. Each one of those different pieces that you have are an opportunity to help tell the overall story. And you want to do this in a very decisive and deliberate and intentional way, thinking about the flow from the beginning of the proposal to the end, how all of these things can align. So they should all be designed to support that larger effort. And they all should be inspirational as well as compelling. Again, the idea behind these is that you're trying to inspire people to get behind your project and have the grant review panelists select your project as a whole. There's a number of different resources that are out there. This book by Cheryl Clark is one that I use regularly with some of my graduate students when I'm teaching grant writing. It's called Storytelling for Grant Seekers. And it's really helpful with regards to talking about some of the different tools and techniques that we emphasize. And this other one just came out, I think a year ago in 2021, called Grant Writing for Storytelling. And it's more of like a technical how to go through the whole process. So I recommend looking at these different resources. And one of the best things to do too when you're writing a grant is talk with other grant writers or ask the program officers if they have examples of successful grants and look at those different grants. MHA has examples of capital and non-capital grants that are successful posted on their website. And I know other organizations do that as well. So it's sometimes helpful to go through that process and really identify other tools that can help you become a better grant writer.
Great. Thank you. We have another question. It says, do you find yourself using a different voice for different grantors based on what you know of them?
Sometimes, yes. So for example, when I was just writing an NEH grant with Mount Holyoke College and some professors, and they want things framed from a humanities perspective, obviously, but it tends to be much more scholarly. When I'm looking at local community foundations or particular groups that I know tend to be much more informal in terms of the format, I'll adopt a much more informal voice. So again, it's really thinking about the grant funder, but also being true to yourself, because essentially, if you're honestly and authentically passionate and enthusiastic about the project, that can come across in the writing pretty well too. So it's something to keep in mind. Obviously, when you're doing a federal grant, it is a task to try to just lay out all the information. But when you're applying something for a smaller grant, it becomes less of an issue because it doesn't need the kind of same level of technical pieces, but it also doesn't give you as much space to tell your story. So it's a balance back and forth, but I will change my voice depending on who the funder is.
I have another question. Is including a website regarding the project helpful in telling the story?
Including a website? I think it depends on the project. So, I mean, if you're talking about a major capital project that's going to be being developed over an extended period of time, many different years, and is very complicated, having a website might be beneficial to just lay out all of your information. If you're talking about, a more simplified exhibit or a lesson plan for school teachers, that's not something that's going to be really useful. And the reason for that is the grant reviewers in general don't have the kind of time to do a lot of that investigation. But if you're going to create this massive project over an extended time, over many years, you're going to leverage that probably for multiple grant purposes, for sharing with the public, possibly governmental agencies, political leadership, things like that as well. So really, again, thinking about the return on investment is really crucial. So if you're going to spend the time and effort and devote the resources to creating the website, it really should be a significant project that's going to be able to attract a considerable amount of money.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions? And I just wanted to add, as a grant reviewer, 2 projects sticking out in my mind. One was a grant application for some oral histories. And during the urgency, they talked about the importance of doing oral history because of the age of those who they were interviewing, but they finished it up with a picture of the cemetery. And it drove the message home, and everyone who was reviewing the grant went, oh. And yeah, that was one that seemed to really stick out. And the last one is Dudley's Chapel for last year, who had applied for MHAA, I think 3 or 4 years in a row, of talking about the problem they had with their roof. But last year they included the picture of the tarp on the roof, and then it was funded.
And again, those types of things have a significant impact, those visual images for a number of people. It's no longer abstract. They can see what is actually happening on the ground in a much more deliberate way than just reading a word on a piece of paper on our computer screen. And I know, especially with these oral histories, I started working with an organization in July, and we did a visioning session about stories and people that were important to this particular community. And we've lost 5 or 6 people since July. So again, those types of things might not seem important when you're starting to put together a grant because there's not a right place for it. But if you incorporate that into your story, it clearly shows that sense of urgency, and the loss of knowledge and local history is just unfathomable when those types of things happen. So that's a way of incorporating that into a story that's very different than a typical grant when people are putting together just qualitative or quantitative information into charts.
And before we switch gears, I want to see if there are any more questions on storytelling. Just as a reminder, the MHAA grants are due in our heritage area on March 11th. And so that you know, there were 240 intent to applies included statewide, which is actually down significantly from last year. But that gives you an idea on how important it is to make your grant and your story clear, compelling, and make sure you tell that urgency. We're going to switch gears a little bit to talk about that all-important match. Katie Parks is the Deputy Director of Preservation Maryland, and she is also used to work here on the shore, so she's very familiar with us. She lived in Caroline County, and she's going to talk about Preservation Maryland, who has just a wonderful grant program that could serve as a match for many of our projects. I'll turn it over to you, Katie.
Great, thank you, Gail. Happy to be here and see a few familiar names, which is always nice. So I'll do a quick overview on Preservation Maryland before talking more detail about the Heritage Fund, but we're a statewide nonprofit. working to protect the state's unique and irreplaceable heritage. And we do that through strategic programming and partnerships. And we like to say that we're using the best of our past to solve some of today's biggest issues, including climate change, affordable housing, and workforce development. And one piece within that is grant making. And so we do manage the Heritage Fund, which is a cooperative agreement of Preservation Maryland and the Maryland Historical Trust. And the program provides direct assistance for protection of historical and cultural resources. And we really group the funding into three categories within the program: it's education and research, planning and feasibility, and repair and rehabilitation. So the grant program is quite flexible. It is eligible to nonprofit organizations and local governments. The projects do need to be located in the state of Maryland, but can include everything from stabilization, acquisition of an endangered historic property, to feasibility studies, historic resource reports, education, research, and planning efforts related to resource preservation, organizational development for local preservation organizations, and we even allow for legal services related to protecting endangered historic resources, which can mean a lot of different pieces. So we do distribute funding within 2 grant rounds each year. We currently have a round open. Those applications are due March 18th, and we distribute around $100,000 a year total between those 2 grant rounds. And so grants are on the smaller side. They are between $1,000 and $10,000 for the program. I think last year we had 72 applications come in, and we did make 15 grants within that $1,000 to $10,000 range. And it was a mix of brick and mortar and education and research and planning and feasibility. And we do try to distribute geographically across the state for that program. There's a small match required that's either cash or in kind of 10% of the ask. And we're always looking for kind of worthy and interesting projects across the state. So I'd be happy to answer any specific questions folks may have about the program.
Great, thank you. And I just want to give Preservation Maryland a big shout out, because they have been instrumental in helping us, the heritage areas, maintain our funding to be able to provide the grants that the heritage area program provides, and also for getting an increase in some of the tax credit programs and Maryland rehabilitation tax credit programs that we'll just touch on briefly. So they're an excellent partner, and I would encourage everyone to support Preservation Maryland and to keep in touch with them to let them know what's going on in your region.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Gail.
Thanks. Does anyone have any questions for Katie? All right, thank you, Katie.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to go over very quickly just a lot of finding that match. And as we speak, you'll notice that I keep talking about match for state funds. That's because in our world, the stories of the Chesapeake world, the Maryland Heritage Area Authority grant is sort of the sun over about which we all rotate. Partially is because there's so much funding available through that program. When you talk about matches, you're going through your application, you'll see that there's lots of different types of funding that are out there. There's sources of funding that can count as match. You have your federal grants, your state grants, your foundations, your donations, your civic, your other kind of grants, and in kind. So our federal funding, some of the federal funds that are available that would count as a match, because when you think about your match, state funds cannot match state funds. So if you're going for an MHAA grant or an African American Heritage grant or some of the other state grants that require match, you need to be looking elsewhere other than other state programs. Same with the Rural Maryland Council grants. The state can't match state. Federal grants are eligible for and a good match for some of our grants, but there are issues going along with federal grants. You can find grants for preservation projects for the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities. USDA is a very interesting source. You would think the Department of Agriculture would not necessarily have grants that apply to funding for preservation projects, but they do. They have rural development grants under the USDA grants. There are grants not necessarily for your preservation program, but there might be grants to actually put the furniture in once your building's restored, to get the furniture in that you need. So contacting the USDA office, which is in Delaware, Maryland and Delaware's USDA programs are together for the Eastern Shore, and that office is in Dover. The staff there is very helpful to talk to you about what the potential grants are, what's required, and to look at your project and let you know what might be the best fit. There's scenic byway funds. This is a fund that is congressionally appropriated, so sometimes it's available, sometimes it's not. But again, it's a great match for particularly interpretive projects. There's a wide variety of trail grants that come from a wide variety of sources, everything from federal highway, the National Park Service, and others. Community development block grants. National Archives and Records have grants for archival information that might be a grant for some of your research. The Institute for Museums and Library Services provide certain grants. The National Park Service has a large number of grants that would be excellent matches for MHAA grants. The Chesapeake Country Gateway grants, again, they were grants that were very abundant for a while. Then they went away for, I want to say, 10 to 15 years. But it's my understanding that the Chesapeake Bay Gateway grants are being refunded again. The American Battlefield Protection grants, the National Center for Preservation, Training and Technology, and Historic Preservation grants. There are all sorts of federal grants available, and you can go onto a website called grants.gov to just search. You kind of put in the type of grant you're looking for, and potential grants and their due dates pop up when you do the search at grant.gov. It's a single access point to over 900 federal grants, and it gives you the ability to search and also gives you the links to the application. One of the issues or the challenges with federal grants is they require what's called a SAM. And the SAM is now switching. It used to be related to your DUNS number. Now there's another way to get a SAM. But if you're thinking about applying for federal grants, you need to get to work on getting your SAM, because it is not necessarily a quick process. It wasn't a quick process before COVID, so I'm sure it's not going to be a quick process now. Also, most federal grants have significant reporting and audit requirements. So if you're a small organization that isn't used to grant writing, you probably don't want to apply for a federal grant. But what you may want to do is look in our region and see, is there a partner that you might want to include that may be a good fit? One of our colleges, perhaps one of our bigger organizations could be a partner in your organization that are used to having these audit and reporting requirements. So the state funds, and as I said, state funds generally cannot match state funds. But before you write off a potential funding source as saying, oh, well, that's not going to be a match, you might want to just double check and make sure that the state funding opportunity isn't a pass-through from federal funds. Some of the trail grants that come through the State Highway Administration are actually federal funds, but the state is doing a lot of the audit and the more difficult work and making that grant fund a little easier to handle. The same with Maryland Humanities. They have had some pass-through grants, and also the Maryland Historic Trust occasionally has some pass-through grants. Another great way to use some state funds is particularly if yours is a brick and mortar project. As it's moving along and it's clear that your project is going to happen, you can work with your Maryland delegation to put in a bond bill to help fund your project. Now, it can't match MHAA, but again, it's another way to get some significant funding. The state funds, the wide variety of funds available at the state level. For preservation project, a good place to start is to look at the Maryland Historical Trust website, which then lists all the various grants that come from Maryland Historic Trust associated programs. That includes the MHAA grants, which, if you're not familiar, are up to $50,000 for programming and $100,000 for capital projects. It is also a great program for small grants for marketing and block grants. The Maryland Historic Trust capital and non-capital grant program. The capital grant program application is actually due March the 16th. And it is a great program if you're not in a heritage area, or if you're a church or some of these other applications. It's just another way to get funding for capital projects. The African American Heritage Preservation Grants is a grant program specific to the restoration and interpretation of African American heritage sites. That application is typically due in June, usually opens up sometime in the spring. There is a historic preservation loan program. And then there are state and federal rehab tax credits that run through the Maryland Historic Trust. And that could be a whole workshop of itself, of dealing with the state and federal rehab tax credits. But the idea is, if you are restoring a structure that is on the National Register or in a local historic district, you can apply for state tax credits that refunds a certain portion of your expenses in renovating your projects. And there have been several projects that have used these tax credits a little bit at a time. They would do the small commercial, large commercial, and homeowner tax credits. The Department of Housing and Community Development has a large number of sources. Community Legacy Program, Community Investment Tax Credits, Technical Assistance Grants Programs, and Operating and Technical Assistance Grants. The Community Legacy Program is wide open, needs to be in a town, and is a very great program. The Community Investment Tax Credits, if you are doing a large project that you need to do some fundraising from local organizations, you can apply to the Housing and Community Development for Community Investment Tax Credits, and they will give you, if you're selected, they can give you between $5,000 or $10,000 in tax credits, which then you can in turn give to an individual or business that donates to your fundraising. So it's a great way to reward your donors. And this tax credit, it is not a donation credit, it's a credit at the bottom, across the bottom. There's also federal tax credits that, again, the community investment tax credits and the federal tax credits would be its own workshop on how to get those and make those work for you. But those are great resources to be able to reward your major donors. The operating and technical assistance grants programs are available for nonprofits, and they're for capacity building for nonprofits. State highways, you have the Transportation Enhancement Program, which is a pass-through from the feds, the Scenic Byway Program, the National Recreation Trail Program, and other grants. See, we have a couple of questions. Okay, got it. Other state funds, You have the Rural Maryland Council. Their grants are usually requires an intent to apply due usually middle of July, and the application's due middle of May, and the application is due generally middle of July or August. And that the Rural Maryland Council applies for all sorts of different programs throughout the state, and it's a great way to supplement any other funding you may have for your project. And same with the Arts Council. So now we're going to move into national nonprofit organizations. This is another way to get your match. There is an organization or a program called the Grants Foundation, where you can go in and you can search foundations to see if there's a foundation that fits your project. The Grants Foundation, we are very lucky that the Midshore Community Foundation and Chesapeake College have subscriptions to the Grant Foundation that they make available to our local nonprofits in the area, and they can also teach you how to use the Grants Foundation. The Getty Foundation and the 1772 Foundation are ones that have specific grants dealing with preservation, for example. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, you don't think of them as being a nonprofit organization, but they are, have a large number of grants that are available that are an excellent match. And these reporting, while the reporting is still important to have important program, it is not as significant and as onerous as federal grants. For our purposes, probably the most important one for us in our area is the Bartis True Fund. The Bartis True Fund was funded from a gentleman named Bartis True, who donated the proceeds for the sale of his farm and his historic house, Providence Plantation, to create a fund for preservation projects on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. So while this is the National Trust Program, this Bartis True Fund is specific only to Eastern Shore projects. So we've narrowed the competition down significantly. The Bartis True Fund applications are generally due in the 1st of June, and they are typically grants of $5,000 to $10,000. There's the African American Heritage Fund, the National Fund for Sacred Places, the Heart Fund for small towns, which also might be an interesting fit for us, and other various preservation funds that are small grants given out on a rotating schedule. There's usually a March, a summer, there's usually a spring, a summer, and fall round for those. To be able to apply for most of the grants from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, your organization does need to be at least an organization level member of the National Trust. That is a $250 application. Some statewide nonprofits, we've already heard from Preservation Maryland. The Maryland Center for History and Culture, there is the Millard Fund. That is state funds, so it cannot match MHAA. And Maryland Humanities, they have a mini grant program, a major grant program, and I put other grants because in this year's session of the General Assembly, there's a proposal from Maryland Humanities to create what they call SHINE grants, which would be operating grants for nonprofits working in the humanities. And all of those are from private or federal funds. So the Maryland Humanities grants are eligible for MHAA grants. So there's other funds that are out there. The Midshore Community Foundation is a great resource for our region. The Midshore Community Foundation and Chesapeake Charities both represent different funds for all sorts of nonprofit projects. They are typically not large grants, And usually, at least the Midshore Community Foundation grant applications are due usually in the fall. Both Choptank Electric and Delmarva Power have funds for projects. Choptank Electric has a fund that helps pay for events. And then there's the community reinvestment programs that local banks are supposed to be doing, where they reinvest into their local community. It is a requirement of the banking industry that they do have those. So you've gone through and you think you have everything. And luckily, MHAA and the Maryland Historic Trust grants now are any combination of cash and in-kind, which makes it so much easier to find the match. So what is an in-kind match? It's volunteer time, it's donated services, donated materials, donated room space, mileage, and travel. So you should check your grant guidelines to see what sort of rates, see if they have a rate identified in the grant guideline that they want you to use for volunteer time and for travel. If not, you can check the independent sector for a yearly rate for Maryland. And while it's important to use independent sector, and it is because they have the volunteer rate by state. Maryland's current rate is $31.29 an hour for volunteer. That is significantly higher than the national level. And that's why it's important to be able to check your state, and because it's going to vary from state to state, and to check your guidelines to see what they're going to say. The same with travel, check the guidelines. If there's not anything in the guidelines, then you use the IRS rate for travel. It's important to document your in-kind match. There's a wide variety on the website, on the internet, of volunteer times and mileage logs. The ones we use at the Stories of the Chesapeake are actually very simple. We have a combination of a wonderful spreadsheet that was created by one of our members, where you just put in the time you spent, the date you did it, and what you did. And when you're driving, your mileage to get to where you're going and to get to where you're back. And remember, when you're documenting your in-kind time, it's not just the time that you spent at the event or doing whatever you're doing to volunteer. It's also the time you spent going and coming to that place. And at $31.29, it adds up very quickly. None of this in-kind, or actually any of the other cash match, typically can be spent prior to the award of the grant. So all the time you spend preparing your grant and having people review your grant will not count towards your match when your grant is awarded. How do you document your volunteer donations of services and materials? You can get a letter from them, or if they gave you a discount on their usual price, have them include that discount on the invoice they send you. That way you have that proper documentation. If somebody has donated a room that is somebody normally charges for, get the room rental form showing what the usual rate would be. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Great. Well, we thank you for attending, and if you have any questions, I am always available. I'm always available to help you with writing your grant, reviewing your grant, and talking to you about potential matches.
Thank you all for participating.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.